Well, we're reminded again of our one-sentence overview of Micah, aren't we? There it is on the screen. Godliness brings consequences, but God will complete his purpose with those who listen and turn back to him. And what a relief that is. There's a continuousness about that statement, isn't there? It's not in the past, it wasn't God would. No, God will. And that's the relevance for us today, because we are part of those who have been called to the great hope that is contained in the Scriptures. And we're again reminded of just where Micah prophesied. So this is our sort of getting our minds back into the space where we are, this incredible time of great turmoil so far as the international scene was concerned, and ecclesially as well, with the northern kingdom going into captivity and Micah prophesying during those sort of pivotal years of the kings in Judah. And now we looked last time at the first prophecy, hear all you people. We want to look at the second, hear, O heads of Jacob. Now, we're not going to get through the whole lot. So last class was a bit of a marathon effort to be able to try and get through the first bit. We're actually planning to get through to just the first 5 verses of chapter 4. So if you sort of sit in there watching your clock and thinking he's running out of time, fear not, fear not. We'll be spending a good section of tomorrow's session finishing off the deliverance section. But as we've seen with all of these parts, is the judgment part and the deliverance part. And the second overall part of Micah is no different in that structure. Chapter 3 is the judgment. Chapters 4 and 5, God speaks of the deliverance. Now, this particular part, the second part of Micah's prophecy, hear, O ye heads of Jacob, right from the outset, this involves all of us. Right? Sometimes it's easy to look at that and you say, oh, well, this is going to be a good session. This is going to be for the heads. I can sort of sit back and enjoy hearing some message that comes from God that's not related to me. Well, if that's what you're thinking, bad luck, because it relates to us all, brothers and sisters. It relates to us all. You know, one of those amazing things about the symbol of sheep and shepherds, of course, is that we are at the same time both sheep and shepherds, aren't we, within the ecclesia. That's God's expectation of us. We're not the Lamb of God, that's the Lord Jesus Christ. We're not the great shepherd, that's, of course, the Lord Jesus Christ as well. But in the same way that he is both a lamb and a shepherd, we are called to the same thing. We are at one and the same time sheep and shepherds. God expects us to be our brother's keeper. And so these words that we're going to be looking at, whilst directed specifically at the leadership that was in place through particularly Judah, they are as applicable to us as they ever are to those that Micah was specifically writing to. And we need to take it that way. We need to take these as lessons for ourselves, not as prophecies directed at someone else. So this second prophecy, just to sort of set the time frame as to roughly when it is, we believe, the end of King Ahaz's reign and into the beginning of King Hezekiah. And we'll see a little bit later why we think that's the case. In fact, you probably already know that because you can sort of date it from the end of chapter 3 that we touched on a little bit earlier in our studies. But let's pick it up in chapter 3 of Micah. And here we get the beginning of the second part of the prophecy. And we made the note before, didn't we? And I said, says Micah, and then he goes on to describe it, is probably our best little point of the fact that this is the best of Micah. You know, Micah has sort of put together this compilation of his prophecy over a whole period of time. He's built this structure in place, which makes it easier for us to follow and helps us to get the message that God wants from it. This prophecy is not just about destruction. It's not just about judgment. That's the warning. That's the call to change. But there's a deliverance aspect to it as well. Do you know that idea of structure, that we've already seen at a high level for the whole of the book comes through the individual parts of this particular part of Micah as well. You can see that because he's going to talk to the heads. And then he splits up, as it were, chapter 3 to cover off the different types of heads. So verses 1 through 4 are the secular leaders. They're the heads of Jacob, the princes of the house of Israel. And then in verses 5 through 8, he deals with the prophets. So first of all, he deals with, if you like, the leaders of the people in matters that are secular. Then the prophecies that are given moves across to the spiritual side. And then in verses 9 through 12, he covers all the leadership. Heads, princes, priests, and prophets. The priests get brought into the section that deals with this judgment piece, where the leadership had gone so astray so far as God was concerned. And these leaders had a greater accountability than the people. And that makes sense, doesn't it? There's a greater accountability. See that in verse 1? They've got a responsibility to know and to exercise justice. In fact, the ISV puts it this way. It says, you should know justice, should you not? Puts it as a question. King James Version is similar, isn't it? Is it not for you to know judgment? Well, you should know it. God has an expectation on these people who are in positions of authority, but again, of course, it applies to us all because we understand what it means to help and to lead and to guide each other as we make our way to the kingdom. And God has an expectation that we know. No point saying we don't know, because we do. It's all here. But the sad thing in Micah chapter 3 is whether they knew justice as a theory or not, there was no application of it. And you see that in verse 2, isn't it? So the question raised by Micah, you should know what judgment is, in verse 2 demonstrates that they have no ability to apply it because they hate the good and love the evil. And this idea of hating good and loving evil is a theme that is picked up elsewhere in the Bible. And it's worth us just turning to it. Come back to Psalm 52. We get a feel for what kind of person hates good and loves evil. Now, Psalm 52, we're in no doubt as to who the individual is that fits into this category. You can see that from the superscription of the psalm. Maskil, a psalm of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said unto him, David is come to the house of Ahimelech. And we know that story, don't we? That evil man lurking in the corner when David came up in fear of his life, and Doeg watching Ahimelech give David the sword of Goliath and the food that was taken from the table of showbread. And here's David writing about that man. A leader in Israel. That's what Doeg was, as staggering as it is, an Edomite. Chief herdsman, chief shepherd. Someone who should have known justice in the context of Micah. Why, verse 1, why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? Why boastest thou thyself in mischief? There's a warning in that, isn't there? He's pretty happy with the position that he had. He was okay exercising his authority to achieve his own ends. And in contrast, the goodness of God endureth continually. There was Doeg thinking that he was going to be able to exercise his power because he was in a position of power, that ultimately against God who endures continually, he had no power at all. Verse 2, thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor. Now remember those words. Like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. There's a couple of things that are picked up in the context of this man that loves evil more than good. Sharp razor, devouring words. We know the destruction, of course, that Doeg wreaked upon faithful people in the house of Israel. And there's a characteristic that Doeg got. We're not going to go back to the actual record and look at it there, but Doeg exercised his power violently to his own ends, didn't he? You may remember the situation there. He ended up, Saul, when his own men wouldn't fall upon the priests, and neither they should have, and Saul turns to Doeg. Doeg did, killed the lot, or almost the lot, except for one that escaped, killed the lot, and then killed the whole city of Nob. Men, women, children, and, as it happened to take all their stuff for himself. There's those who love evil and hate the good and use violence to achieve it. They're not just doing gratuitous violence for the sake of it, it's for personal gain. And remember those things, remember them, because we're going to see the same principles and lessons come up in Micah. Now, Amos, no need to turn this one up, but Amos, in his prophecy, which is only 30 years before Micah's prophecy, deals with exactly the same issues. People treading on the poor. They build houses of hewn stone, but they're oppressing those that have nothing. They afflict the just. They take a bribe. They turn aside the poor in the gate. Amazing, isn't it? And in contrast, let's turn this one up. This is a good one, Isaiah chapter 7. This is the contrast, brothers and sisters. You've got flesh achieving what it can for itself, outworking in a violent, devouring, like a sharp razor way, because they love the evil and hate the good. Well, here's the contrast in Isaiah 7. Now, of course, Isaiah 7 is not only contemporary with Micah's prophecy, but is actually prophesying of someone who in the first application of it was none other than Hezekiah. Well, what's that man like? Verse 10. Now, we know it's not the ultimate fulfillment is, of course, the Lord Jesus Christ. But here's the story in Micah, Isaiah 7, verse 10. Moreover, Yahweh spake again unto Ahaz. So here we are, the same king that Micah's prophesying to. Ask thee a sign of Yahweh thy God. Ask in the depth or the height above. Ahaz said, I'm not going to do that, despite the fact that God told him to. Of all the frustrating things that Ahab was, couldn't even take simple direction from God. And he said, hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men? Are you going to weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. That's the contrast, isn't it? That's the contrast. People in Micah's time who loved the evil and hated the good. Doeg the Edomite in the same way. People in Amos's time oppressing the poor people so that they could gain riches for themselves. And here's the contrast. Here's the contrast. Emmanuel, God with us. The leader, the true leader, who would choose the good and hate the evil. What a relief it is when we see that kind of leader and know that that's the leader that we have, brothers and sisters. And every one of these types of leadership, back in Micah chapter 3, every one of them has that same motivation that Doeg did. I think it's the beauty of the way this prophecy is being constructed here in Micah, that the root cause is clear for everyone to see. Have a look at verse 11 of Micah chapter 3. If we're not quite sure why the leaders behaved the way they did, God describes it for us in verse 11. The heads thereof judge for reward. That's it. For reward. The priests thereof teach for hire. You make money from this. The prophets thereof divine for money. So the motivation of the corrupt leadership in Micah's time is there in verse 11. Doesn't matter whether you're a secular leader, a prophet, or a priest. They're in it for what they can get. Every one of them motivated by self-gain. But they go about it in different ways. And again, the lesson for us is so powerful in this because there's different mechanisms that are used to achieve their desired outcome. The outcome is the same. Reward, profit, money, self-gain. But the methodology is different. Have a look at the princes. What's their methodology to achieve their own ends? Well, it's violence, isn't it? Verse 1 to 4. And what a violent picture it is. Verse 2, they pluck off the skin from the people. Their flesh from off their bones. They eat the flesh of my people. Flay their skin from off them. And that's not enough. That's not enough. I mean, that's a fairly comprehensive consumption, we might say, isn't it? That's not, I was going to say mincing matters, but that's probably a poor one to use. Because they do mince matters, don't they? Look what they do. They break their bones. They chop them in pieces, as for the pot, as flesh within the cauldron. And the picture that God's creating through Micah the prophet here is of leaders that are utterly consuming the people. Utterly consuming them, skinning them alive, taking all the flesh off, breaking all the bones up, grinding them up, sticking them into the cauldron for their soup. There's nothing left. Not even the bones are left. Remarkable. Remarkable, isn't it? And as physically violent a time as the period of Ahaz's reign was, this, in Micah chapter 3, it's not describing their physical oppression of the people. Let's not think for a moment that the leaders in Micah's time were actually physically getting hold of people and ripping their skin off and taking their flesh off and chopping. No, God's not talking about that. Describes it like that because that's effectively what they were doing. But they weren't physically doing it. Not at all. Just like we don't physically grab our brothers and sisters or fellow young people and rip their skin off and break their bones. No, we'd never do that. No, we'd never do that. But we might be doing it spiritually, brothers and sisters and young people. And we know that's the case. Come with me across to Galatians chapter 5. Paul picks up this almost identical language in Galatians. And this is the lesson, isn't it? Otherwise we read these things and we say, well, when's the last time I killed somebody and chopped their bones up for a pie? I don't think I've ever done it. It's because we're not talking about literally, but how many of us are guilty of the same actions as Paul picks them up in Galatians chapter 5. And as I said, Paul seems to be picking up this theme from Micah. Have a look at verse 15. If ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. Now again, Paul's not talking about people literally eating each other, is he? It's not the Galatian ecclesia had, a group of cannibals in the middle of the ecclesia. It's not saying that at all. He goes on to explain what he does mean. So this is all about the flesh versus the spirit. A fleshly way of thinking versus a spiritual way of thinking is Paul's point. And when the flesh and the spirit come head to head, then there's friction. He says that in verse 12, doesn't he? Oh, would they were even cut off which trouble you. There's friction in the ecclesia. Because believers were using the truth to serve their own ends, to serve their flesh in verse 13. That's the problem. They're serving their flesh. They are doing what they do to personally gain from the exercise, just like the leaders in Micah's time were doing what they did to personally gain from the exercise, just like Doeg did what he did to personally gain through that exercise. And Paul goes on to describe what those actions are. And we know the words, don't we? Verse 19 onwards. The works of the flesh. This is what biting and devouring is. This is what cannibalism, spiritual cannibalism is. Flaying the skin off, tearing off the flesh, breaking the bones, grinding them up, throwing them into a pot. This is what it is. Let me read from the ESV. You follow on in the King James Version if you've got it in front of you. Now, the works of the flesh are evident. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality. Now, say, oh, well, not too bad. Not too bad. Don't really do much of them. The list goes on. Idolatry. Oh, well, we don't worship Baal and stuff. We might have a nice car or a nice boat or our career. Sorcery, he goes on. Enmity. Strife. Jealousy. Now we're getting down to the minor stuff, aren't we? These are still the works of the flesh. This is biting and devouring each other. The definition that Paul talks about and describing this activity within the ecclesia. Jealousy. Anyone prepared to put their hand up and say they've never been jealous? You don't have to do that, by the way. We can relate to this, can't we? We've all got, as it were, the fangs of the cannibal a little bit in us, don't we? And if we're still thinking it doesn't apply to us, look at the next one. Fits of anger. Fits of anger. Rivalries. Dissensions. Divisions. Envy. Do you know, the power of what Paul says is that we are all guilty of it, aren't we, brothers and sisters? We're all guilty of it. It might not be the same manifestation each time, but they're all the works of the flesh. They're all the thinking of the flesh. It's all, without God, it's us biting and consuming one another. Sure, sometimes the chunks we take out of our brothers and sisters might be less at some times than they are at other times, but it's still spiritual cannibalism. And as Paul goes on to say, things like these, I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And that's the warning that Micah gives to the prophet, to the leaders rather, the secular leaders back in Micah chapter 3. And it's like God strips away all the edifice of civilization from them. You know, we go about our lives, and perhaps a little bit like Job's three friends, isn't it? We come up with a million reasons why we can justify our own jealousies or our rivalries or why someone else should be suffering what they're suffering and all of that kind of stuff. But really, at the end of the day, it's just those things, those works of the flesh that Paul picks up in Galatians chapter 5. It's just them manifested. And God says, you know what they're like? You know what they're like? Forget wallpapering them with nice pretty pictures of flowers and apparent scenes of godliness. They're just like cannibals. What about the second group? The second group of heads, leaders that come under the spotlight are the prophets. And you can see them in Micah chapter 3 verse 5. Thus saith Yahweh concerning the prophets. So he's turned away from the secular leaders who utilised, if you like, the violent means, the envies, the strifes, the dissensions, to be able to achieve their own ends, their own profit. Now he turns to the prophets. And they're slightly different from the princes. Have a look at halfway through the verse. They cry peace. Well, that's nice, isn't it? They cry peace. That's what we like to hear. They're quite different, clearly, from the secular leaders. But it's not really peace, is it? They cry peace. But the impact of what they say and do is just as destructive as the violence of the princes. They make, says God, they make my people err. See that in verse 5? They make my people err. They bite with their teeth. And they cry peace. It seems incongruous, doesn't it? How can you be biting with your teeth and crying peace at the same time? But, you know, that word bite there, it's quite distinct. Hebrew's norshak. It means to strike with a sting as a serpent, says Strong. So the princes, the secular leaders, well, they were just out and out violent. They were engaged in strife and dissension and jealousy and things. But the prophets, they're a little more deceptive, weren't they? They cried peace, but the outworking of that was like a serpent sting. As it were, not the lion's jaws of the first set of secular leaders. And you can't miss the point. You cannot miss the point. We made the same point in chapter 2 of Micah, didn't we? When the prophets there would, you know, they were basically wanting to be fed again, same motivation, self-advancement, self-promotion, self-achievement here, and they prophesied what the people wanted to hear. Now, people say, we don't want to hear what Micah the prophet's saying. You tell us what we want to hear. Well, this is the same thing here. This is what the prophets in Micah chapter 3 were doing. And it seems unkind, doesn't it? It seems unkind to the flesh when we stand for the truth. Who wants to be told that they're like a spiritual cannibal? Who wants to be told that they're biting and snapping and causing grief to their brothers and sisters? No one wants to hear that. Everyone would prefer to be told that they're great. Oh, yeah, you're sending peace, brother. Sounds much kinder message, doesn't it? But you know, while standing for the truth seems unkind to the flesh as we say it, the true destruction is when we tell the lies of the serpent in Eden. And you know, if you think about it, you know, you shall not surely die seems much nicer than in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. But the outworking of the two statements demonstrates the statement that is actually the kindest, doesn't it? What was the consequence of the serpent's advice to Eve? She took the fruit. She did what God said not to do. Mortality. And all the consequences associated with that. Powerful lesson for us, isn't it? It's a contemporary lesson for us, brothers and sisters and young people. And listen to God's word, not what the world is saying. Everything will be okay. The outworking of a lie is actually more fatal than a serpent's sting, isn't it? And that's the warning from the prophets. So you end up with the same outcome. People are being destroyed. The same outcome that the princes did. Their devouring appetite destroyed the people because they were eating them up. And then the prophets, their lies that they spoke were like a serpent's sting, still devouring the people, just in a different way. You know, you can see the motivation of the prophets there in the end of verse 5, isn't it? They cry peace, and he that putteth not into their mouths, they even prepare war against him. Oh, what kind of prophets are these? If you line their pockets, they'll tell you peace. If you don't, those sweet-speaking prophets are lining up their armaments against you. The old motivator of personal gain is a powerful one, isn't it? And a great lesson for us. Again, you know, we don't read these words and think, oh, disgusting. How could the people be like that? There's no point doing that, is there? No point doing that. There is a fair bit of point, though, reading these words and thinking, how do I fare? How do I fare? You know, 3 verse 8 of Micah is one of those another one of those interesting little insertions where Micah breaks into the prophecy. So, he's giving the prophecies, faithfully saying the words of God. And just like we saw he did in chapter 1, where he just could not handle the sadness of the message that he was giving about the destruction that was coming upon the people, here in chapter 3, verse 8, Micah jumps in again. It's another one of his personal reflections in the middle of his prophecy. And what he does is he contrasts his own calling and position with the characteristics that were evident in the heads of Jacob, both the princes and the prophets. And you can see this contrast come through. And he's not doing it because he wants to boast. He's not doing it to point the finger, as it were. He's just doing it because everything that should be in place so far as leadership is concerned, God exposes as being flawed. And he makes this contrast between himself and the heads of Jacob. I, he says, am full of power by the Spirit of Yahweh. But God said, these false prophets, they're not even going to have a vision. They'll look for a vision from me, but they're not going to have it. I'm full of judgment, he says. Well, that was what the princes should have known. God's expectation of them was, you should know judgment. And Micah says, I'm full of might. Well, in their own way, they thought they were full of might, didn't they? They were going to pluck up, they were going to eat, they were going to flay, they were going to break, they were going to chop up. But their might wasn't the might of Micah, not the might of Yahweh. Transient, destructive, counter to God's way. And Micah had come to declare unto Jacob his transgression, to Israel his sin, and stands in complete contrast to those prophets who made God's people err, who cried peace when there was no peace. The lessons for us, they're in a sense very obvious, aren't they? They're warnings. They're warnings for us in the end of 2021, gathered here from a few different states and locations. Doesn't matter. It's the same lessons. The same lessons as there were in the time that Micah was speaking to those in Judah. Whether we pursue getting our own way through perhaps the methodology of the prophets, the violent way, the end justifies the means, a bit of nepotism, strife, envy, dissension, fits of anger. Well, says God, you're chopping up my people. It's a great lesson, isn't it? Lesson for us all. I'm sure anyone that's involved in any kind of ecclesial interaction whatsoever, committees, whatever the case might be, understands the power of those things. God's called us into ecclesias, not us. God's called us into ecclesias. And he's deliberately put together people that don't necessarily think the same way on all matters. Yes, we believe the truth, we believe the doctrines, that's a given. But the way we go about our lives is different. That's God's masterpiece. Because that way we can be like him. We know what it's like to have to be long-suffering. Don't we? Everyone I thought, it'd be great. Would never have to be long-suffering. Wouldn't necessarily be a great congregation, incidentally. But that's why we're in ecclesias. And God's called these ecclesias together, disparate groups of people called out of darkness with different characteristics and rocks that need shaping. And when we bring them together, it can be hard. There's opportunity for strife. There's opportunity for envy, dissension. There's opportunity for anger. But the true leaders, the true shepherds go and bring the sheep along, don't they? They go and follow the ewes that are great with the lambs. And the bad shepherds are those who bite and devour and consume. So there's a great lesson for us in that. There's a great lesson, as all of us, as shepherds of God's flock, about the way we go about our life in the truth. And that's one warning. The other warning is similarly obvious and powerful. the danger of watering down the true sayings of God to make them more acceptable in a humanistic world. What a warning that is. Can help make us more popular, can't it? Help make us a lot more popular. Made these prophets more popular, telling the people what they wanted to hear. And we're in a world where the world pushes that on every side. You know, how can you believe a God that has right and wrong? The world says. You know, people can't help being like they are. God wouldn't expect this. We've just got to make sure we don't slip into the trap of the leaders of those in Micah's day. Because if we do, then the consequences that are outlined in Micah will apply to us as well. And what terrible consequences they were. Have a look, verse 4. God would turn his face from them. They're going to cry unto Yahweh, but he's not going to hear them. Do we want that, brothers and sisters? Of course we don't. He'll even hide his face from them at that time. He'll blind them from seeing the great truths he's revealed. Verse 6. Night shall be unto you. You're not going to have a vision. Be dark. You're not going to be able to divine. The sun will go down over the prophets. So much for us being able to read and understand and be built up and shaped like living stones. If we go down a path of self-promotion, self-indulgence, self-gratification, I guess you could describe it, even within an ecclesial context, achieving what we want to get our own benefit out of it, then the consequences that happen to these leaders will be the similar consequences for us. And ultimately, these people would be destroyed by God, and it's a terrible thing to consider. And we might be looking at this first section and thinking, wow, okay, but I don't really see the application of this prophecy to myself. Well, don't worry. Neither did the leaders in Micah's time. They didn't see it apply to themselves either. See that in verse 11? Halfway through. They lean upon Yahweh. They say, is not Yahweh among us? None evil can come upon us. They listen to the words of Micah as he gives them in the first part of Micah chapter 3. And they're like, hang on, Micah, hang on. We're leaning on Yahweh. None of this evil that you're talking about is going to come upon us. We're God's people, they say. They even quote scripture, don't they? Is not Yahweh among us? Remember Isaiah 7? Emmanuel, the given at the same time as this prophecy here, the prophecy of the leader that would come. Well, they're saying, well, we're the leadership that's aligned with the great leadership to come, with Emmanuel. But because of their inability in verse 11 to accept the warning of Micah, the judgment on Jerusalem, verse 12 of Micah chapter 3, would match the judgment on Samaria in chapter 1, verse 6. Remember we saw that before? We saw that in, perhaps I think it was the first study that we did. There's a great similarity between Micah 1, verse 6, the words that were prophesied against Samaria. I'll make Samaria as a heap into the field, as plantings of a vineyard. Pour down the stones thereof into the valley, discover the foundations thereof. And Micah chapter 3, verse 12, therefore shall Zion for your sake be ploughed as a field. Jerusalem shall become heaps, the mountains of the house as the high place of the forest. So God's point is, if you're unable to take the warning, then you'll suffer the consequence that Samaria suffered. But you know, there's a good news story associated with this prophecy. Like what a prophecy that is. Imagine being on the receiving end of it. You're a prince in the reign of Ahaz. Ahaz coming to an end. Hezekiah about to, is coming on the throne. And you're a prince or a ruler or a prophet in that period of time. You've been listening to it and thinking, oh, that's me. What do we do? Well, we know what they did. Let's go back to Jeremiah 26. And again, we looked at this one to demonstrate the power of Micah's prophecy and how it was taken all the way to the court of the king. But I want us to think about this prophecy, or this section in Jeremiah 26 now, in the context of what we understand about that prophecy. A message against the leadership. A harsh message. Uncompromising message. Intense. You might even say exaggerated. Not exaggerated in the outcome, but exaggerated in the graphicness of the words that are used. Spiritual cannibalism. In Jeremiah 26, which, again, I won't look at the context of that, we know it. It's when people were debating what they should do with the prophecies that Jeremiah had given. And they were saying, let's not put Jeremiah to death because, verse 16, he's not worthy to die, for he hath spoken to us in the name of Yahweh our God. Then rose up, verse 17, certain of the elders of the land spake to all the assembly of the people, saying, Micah the Morasthite prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and spake to all the people of Judah, saying, and they quote Micah 3, verse 12. Micah 3, verse 12. The section at the end of the heads of Jacob. Verse 19. Did Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all Judah put him at all to death? Did he not fear Yahweh and besought Yahweh? And Yahweh repented him of the evil which he had pronounced against them? That's the response that God's looking for. That's the response. That new king, Hezekiah, hears this dire prophecy from Micah. Devastating prophecy. Yeah, imagine that. You're coming into the kingship. You know, clearly Hezekiah was a godly man. You know, your father wasn't, Ahaz. So that was pretty apparent. And you're coming into the role, and just at the time when everything should be rosy and great, and you've got this great future, and it's all going to be good, you know, Hezekiah, it's like, bang, the prophet gives you the prophecy of Micah chapter 3. Leaders, you're eating each other up. The prophets are biting like a serpent because they're saying things that are false. Every one of you is doing it for your own reward. Not doing it to serve the people, you're doing it for your own reward. And there's Hezekiah, the young king, hearing all of that. What does he do? He doesn't say, now, hang on a second, Micah. We might have done that, mightn't we? Hang on, but you just come to the throne. Don't blame me for my father. No, it doesn't say that. Doesn't say that. He feared Yahweh. He besought Yahweh. And Yahweh repented him of the evil which he had pronounced against them. What a beautiful response that is, isn't it? What a beautiful response. And that's our opportunity. We are here as sheep and shepherds listening to the words of Micah in the day of our opportunity. And that's what God wants us to do. Not to justify why we behave the way we do, just to acknowledge when we are demonstrating those characteristics which are the works of the flesh. We acknowledge them. We beseech Yahweh, and like Hezekiah, God can work with that. Turn Hezekiah into one of the great representations of the Lord Jesus Christ. He becomes Emmanuel to the people that lived at that time. He becomes the ruler in Israel, as we've already seen, to the people that lived in that time. He becomes Christ to the people that live in that time, the Messiah. Amazing. With a father like that. Incredible. Incredible. And, you know, we're not going to leave our study at the end. I deliberately, even though this is a fairly lengthy study, I deliberately, when we go back to Micah, like to push into chapter 4, which is the deliverance section, because if we finished at the end of chapter 3, we wouldn't be doing justice to the message that God is making here. Because Micah's prophecy, that second part, does not finish at chapter 3. It finishes at chapter 5. And in a sort of fitting kind of way, there's one chapter, 12 verses on the judgment, pretty intense 12 verses. God doesn't, he doesn't hold back through Micah in terms of emphasizing their opportunity for improvement. Hits them extremely hard, but then we get these two beautiful chapters, 4 and 5 of Micah, which is God's description of the deliverance. And what a deliverance that would be. In every way that their rulership, before the reformation of Hezekiah, in every way that their rulership was bad, this ruler that God prophesied about was good. Everything stands in contrast. Everything stands in contrast. And as does the beginning of this section of deliverance in chapter 4. Great contrast in chapter 4, verse 1 with chapter 3, verse 12. See the contrast that God's doing? It's God doesn't want to dwell on the consequences. God's not actually interested in the destruction of the wicked. He doesn't want that. He gains no pleasure from it. What he gains pleasure from is the establishment of his purpose. People filled, earth filled with people that think like him. That's what interests God. The wicked will be destroyed. That's a fact. But he gains no pleasure from it. You know, Micah 4, verse 1 to 4, as I'm sure everyone knows, is almost identical to Isaiah 2. Almost identical. In fact, there's one additional verse in Micah that doesn't appear in Isaiah chapter 2. But otherwise, they're identical sections. And that extra verse there, you know, there's all sorts of debate. You read books and people say, I think, Isaiah prophesied first. And then Micah took Isaiah's words from Isaiah chapter 2, because Isaiah was, the prophet and the court of the king and more important and wrote, that. And then other people would come and say, no, I think Micah did it, prophesied first because he's got an extra verse and Isaiah only copied Micah, except whatever. One of the best explanations I heard is maybe God inspired both of them with the same message, independently of each other. How exciting would that be? How exciting would that be? Imagine that. 2 prophets prophesying at the same time, but with different backgrounds, from different locations, really focused on their message in different people. Micah primarily to the people, Isaiah primarily to the court of the king, but both of them having the same prophecy. Wouldn't that be great? Identical. The future hope. Doesn't matter. How sure and firm is that when you hear 2 prophets independently describing exactly the same event? Establishment of God's kingdom. The elevation of Zion. All nations flowing unto it. That would be an incredibly encouraging response, wouldn't it? Motivating. And the 2 prophets themselves, as it were, hear each other's prophecy and they find it's exactly the same. Amazing. Now, Amos picks up that idea, doesn't he? No need to turn to it. Amos 3 verse 7. Surely Adonai Yahweh will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret, singular secret, purpose, that revealed secret to those who are in the know. He revealeth his secret unto his servants the prophets. And here are 2 prophets hearing the same message, giving the same message, prophesying of the same message. And as we said before, Micah 4 really stands in contrast to Micah 3. And you can see this contrast evident by God's rule versus man's rule. There it is, isn't it? I've got up on the screen because it's sort of easier than working it through. But 4 verse 1, this is God's rule. Mountain of the house of Yahweh, exalted above the hills. What happens when man rules? What's the consequence of man's rule? Zion ploughed as a field. Jerusalem heaped. See the difference between the two? Take God out the picture. It's a dark picture. You put God in, magnificent. And it goes on. The righteous ruler in verse 3 will judge among many people. There's what the true ruler does. Exercises true judgment. True justice. And of course we saw in chapter 3 verse 1 the lack of justice, which became a characteristic of the leadership in that time. They should have known. God expected them to know. That's a key part of their role. But they didn't. And chapter 4, verse 3, again, words we know so. Forgive me for not reading them through. You can read them through in your own time. We know them so well. Spears into pruning hooks. swords into plowshares. It's the transformation of destructive weapons into implements that bring forth fruit. They're all fruitful ones, aren't they? Pruning hooks, plowshares, as opposed to the violence by the heads of the people against the flock. They're all destructive ones, aren't they? Flaying, chopping, tearing the flesh off, cutting up the bones, cooking them up in the pot. Complete contrast between leadership. And chapter 4, verse 3 to 4, neither shall they learn war anymore. And that's a true call for peace, isn't it? A true cry of peace. Not the false serpent bite of peace that the false prophets in Micah's time, who cried peace but prepared war. So you see this great contrast that exists between the two. And those contrasts, in my mind, they reinforce the validity of our one-sentence summary of Micah, doesn't it? It really reinforces that. Despite the consequences associated with ungodliness, despite them, God will achieve his purpose. It's one of the most wonderful things. Sometimes you get overwhelmed by the challenges that happen. And it includes in ecclesial life as well, and you think to yourself, things are so hard. Maybe things are causing grief, and there's strife between ecclesias and individuals going in their own way and saying things that we don't believe to be correct, and so on and so forth. Sure, we can all relate to it one way or another. People that once stood for one thing, not standing for it, and we think, oh no, where's it all going to go? Well, I'll tell you where it's going to go. God will achieve his purpose. That's not going to change. That will not change. How good is that? As truly as I live, says God, all the earth shall be full of my glory. What a relief that is. In a sense, it doesn't matter, does it? We've got to do our bit. We've got to try and be faithful shepherds. We've got to try and be faithful sheep. We've got to follow the great shepherd. But God will achieve his purpose. He is all-powerful. What a relief that is. God will complete his purpose with those who respond to him. And that's our call, brothers and sisters, young people. That is our call. As it were, we just have to get on board. God is the one driving that purpose to an end. Now, I just want to close with one element that just emphasises the challenge that Hezekiah would have with even these great words in Micah chapter 4. Because, of course, one of the things that's described here in Micah chapter 4 is in verse 4. In this great description of this future age that would come, but they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. For the mouth of Yahweh of hosts hath spoken it. Right? Remember that verse there. Great relief for the people that are listening to this prophecy. Come with me back to 2 Kings 18. We already touched a little bit on the practical and real challenge that Hezekiah had to face with the Assyrians. It was the manifestation of reality versus, or the application of reality perhaps, versus the theory of trial. The theory of trial is relatively easy, isn't it? The application of it, not so easy. And in 2 Kings 18, it describes, and it was still a time to come, still 30-odd years in the future, but it would be the time to come when the Assyrian was besieging the city of Jerusalem. And Rabshakeh, we know that the record actually gives quite a bit of line space to the words of Rabshakeh. Why? Well, one of the reasons was for us to see just what Rabshakeh knew about the prophecies that God had done. It's absolutely remarkable. Rabshakeh is quite familiar with Micah's prophecy. Isn't that remarkable? And when he delivers his message of fear to the people of Jerusalem, and remember Sennacherib is at Lachish, just down the road, look what he says. He refers in verse 31 to what we just looked at in Micah 4, verse 4. Look at it halfway through. He says, "Come out to me, and then eat ye, every man of his own vine, and every one of his fig tree, and drink ye, every one, the waters of his cistern." There you go. He's quoting Micah 4, verse 4. Does Rabshakeh, the very clever political, manoeuvrer of the Assyrian army. A promise for people to live under their own vine and fig tree. And imagine how challenging this would have been for the people. When you hear prophecy being spoken back to you, it's a bit more challenging, isn't it? Here's Rabshakeh, he's quoting the words of Micah the prophet. Remember those words of Micah the prophet 30-odd years before? Yes. Maybe the Assyrian is actually the fulfillment of what Micah was talking about. Micah 4. Wouldn't have been Micah 4 for them, but, remember that second part of Micah's second part of the prophecy. No wonder the leaders wanted Rabshakeh to speak in the Syrian tongue, and no wonder he refused. He was talking to the people, wasn't he? He was trying to undermine. He wanted to challenge their faith. That there's a distinct difference in the words of Rabshakeh to the words of Micah the prophet. Oh, and this is the powerful point, isn't it, brothers and sisters? This is what we've got to look out for. This is the watch point. Yes, Rabshakeh spoke about a vine and a fig tree and drinking waters of your own cistern, and it sounds like he's quoting scripture. It sounds like he's the fulfillment of God's word. But remember Micah 4, if you've still got it open there, doesn't matter if you haven't. How did Micah 4 verse 4 end? "For the mouth of Yahweh of hosts hath spoken it." And what does Rabshakeh do? Rabshakeh attributes his promise of 2 Kings 18 to the king of Assyria. Verse 31, the beginning. "Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus saith the king of Assyria." Thus saith the king of Assyria. "Make an agreement with me by a present and come out to me. And then eat ye every man of his own vine and every one of his fig tree." That's the challenge we face too, isn't it, brothers and sisters? It's the ultimate challenge of the flesh. It puts us there. It tries to trick us. It tries to quote back scripture. And the challenge for the people in Hezekiah's time is our challenge as well. Where does our allegiance lie? Is it the kingdom of men, or is it the kingdom of God? We live in an age, like all ages, where the kingdom of men is doing everything it can to make us surrender to it. Taking its lead from Rabshakeh here in 2 Kings 18. Whatever it can. Replacing religion with humanism. Trying to moderate God's rights and wrongs in the context of humanistic thinking. And it will use, just like Rabshakeh did, a combination of force and fair words. But we've been called to be part of the flock. Been called to be those in that citadel, haven't we? Who have to put our trust in the breaker. We know that it's only the breaker who will break through the enemy's walls and lead us out to that Tower of Edom. And that's where we'll pick our story up tomorrow.